I'm Ben Meiselas from the Midas Touch Network, joined by Ben LaBolt, White House Communications Director. Welcome, Ben, to the Midas Touch Network.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So I want to talk about this bipartisan debt ceiling bill, emphasizing the bipartisan nature of it. It kind of feels a little bit different from the hostility we've seen and we are used to. Unfortunately, it seems like a genuine compromise was reached. How did this even come about?
Well, as the president said, that's the nature of governing, especially when you have a divided government. Look, there's a few components to this. The first thing and the most important thing is that the government has to be able to pay its bills. And we've heard from Secretary Yellen that on June 5th, just a little over a week from now, the government will be unable to pay its bills if Congress doesn't take default off the table. And so the president has been urging Congress to take default off the table for months. We've now got a bipartisan agreement that would do that. Now, the president has always said default itself is not negotiable. The full faith and credit of the United States is not negotiable. The government pays its bills, and it always has. The debt ceiling has been raised 78 times since 1960, including 3 times under the last administration, and that's an action that Congress must take. But the president has made clear throughout that process as well that he'd be willing to negotiate over a budget agreement. And with a divided Congress, the way to do that is to come forward with a bipartisan agreement. And so now, over the course of the past day, we've got the final text of a bipartisan agreement that we believe can pass with support from Republicans and Democrats in both chambers of Congress. And anytime default has been taken off the table in the past, it's required votes from both Republicans and Democrats to get it done. The same with bipartisan budget agreements. And so there's now legislation going up to the Hill to do just that.
Are you hearing anything from members on the Hill, from Democrats or others, about how their reception is so far to what they've seen?
Well, I think they're just getting the text. The reception so far is fairly positive, but we'll let them judge the agreement itself. Let me walk you through some of the key components of the agreement. The president introduced a budget vision that was very different from Republicans when he introduced his budget on March 9th. It was very focused on fully funding programs that hardworking Americans rely on: education, healthcare, the sorts of investments that you've seen in manufacturing and the clean energy economy that we've seen really be revived under this administration. The Republicans initially put forward a budget with draconian cuts, 22% cuts across the board to education, to healthcare, to law enforcement, to the Border Patrol, to all of these essential programs. And so now the bipartisan budget agreement that's been put forward before Congress is not filled with those draconian cuts that the president was fighting against. And in fact, it protects essential programs like Social Security, which is not touched, Medicare, which is not touched, Medicaid. Millions of Americans rely on Medicaid for their health insurance. That's not touched here. All of the programs like the Chips and Science Act that's allowing us to build a semiconductor industry in this country, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest investment in clean energy ever, that's protected in this agreement. And so the president and his negotiators really brought a set of principles saying, let's make sure to protect those programs. At the same time, we need to make a compromise. So we've agreed to a flat spending level for the next 2 years in exchange for the debt ceiling to be suspended until 2025 so that the country does not default. Those are really the key top line components of this agreement.
You know, we've heard a lot about the fact that Kevin McCarthy was focused on these work requirements for certain programs, like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and others. I guess first and foremost, like, why would there even be a focus there? by Kevin McCarthy and others. And how did that ultimately net out in these discussions? Because I'm hearing mixed things. On the one hand, I'm hearing actually under this deal, eligibility is expanded for homeless individuals and veterans. On the other hand, individuals under 54 have additional requirements and hurdles they have to go to. So how does that all net out?
Well, look, the president fought modifications to those programs. He doesn't think that the budget should in some way penalize the poorest and neediest Americans in this country, and introduced a budget that had different components, right? It included a revenue component that asked the wealthiest and corporations to pay their fair share so that domestic programs essential for hardworking Americans could be preserved. But I think when you look at the end point of this agreement, both sides got some of what they were advocating for. In the food assistance program, for example, the president made sure that veterans and the homeless and children of foster care programs weren't touched at all, and in fact expanded access to food assistance for them regardless of what age they were. The work requirements, which already existed in the food assistance program, were expanded from the age of 49 to 54. That's something that the president fought, but ultimately this was a compromise agreement where both sides had to give. And as I said at the outset, the most important thing was that default, which would tip the economy into recession and could cost us 8 million jobs. The most important thing was that that is taken off the table, and that is taken off the table by June 5th.
We saw a difference, whether you want to call it a negotiating styles or just how individuals carry themselves. It seemed like every single day, Kevin McCarthy was trying to speak to someone, holding press conferences. If there was a camera, you saw Kevin McCarthy there trying to attack Democrats and trying to attack the process. On the other hand, I thought you saw a cool and calm President Biden who actually said, I don't think it's productive during negotiations to start characterizing the negotiations publicly. Can you speak to that stylistic difference, and is that intentional?
Yeah, well, look, I think the objectives in some ways diverge here. I mean, both the president and the speaker certainly want this to be passed, and the president believes Democrats and Republicans should support this bipartisan agreement, that it's essential to avert default and that it's a reasonable agreement for Democrats. I think the president's negotiating style is that there's some times when you publicly set the terms of the debate. And he did that in the State of the Union when he took Medicare and Social Security off the table. He did that on March 9th when he outlined the contours of his budget. And he's been around the country over the past several weeks and months, really defining what he thought a budget agreement should look like that invested in hardworking Americans. But once the Republicans put their agreement forward, and it had a very different view of what a budget should look like, it had draconian cuts in it, the president invited leaders, congressional leaders, all four of them, to the White House to start that negotiation, and then assigned a team to get into the room and work out the details in time to make sure that we avert default. And so I think his view is you don't negotiate all of those details in public, that there is a time for private negotiation to determine what the best path forward is. And then both sides can go out again and explain to their supporters why it's important to pass the legislation. So I think it's just a stylistic difference that's been informed by his ability to deliver these bipartisan agreements over the years, not only as president, as vice president, and through decades in the Senate.
And let's talk about that path going forward now. A deal in principle was reached on Sunday. President Biden made a short address to the nation, announcing for the first time himself that that deal was reached. Where do we go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? We know that June 5th date is looming. So what happens this next week?
Well, it's got to pass through both chambers of Congress, and it's got to pass with bipartisan support to get there. So it will first go to the House. The members of the House have have received the text of the legislation now. They'll have a few days to go through that text. It currently sounds like the vote will be on Wednesday in the House. Then it'll be considered by the Senate. So both chambers and both parties are going to take a close look at this legislation. On the Democratic side, we've already seen, positive comments from everyone but the 100 members in the House New Dems caucus. Congressman Clyburn and others made positive comments as soon as they saw the framework for a bipartisan agreement. So we're encouraged, but ultimately it's going to need a vote from members of both parties. And we're on a tight timeline here to make sure this happens by June 5th.
So what's that like? President Biden's referred to what appears to be a bit of a rift in the Republican Party between Republicans who are truly conservative and so-called MAGA Republicans. And President Biden uses that terminology. We've seen Lauren Boebert, for example, say, count me as a no. You've seen Congressman Bob Good, MAGA Republican, saying that he cannot justify voting for this. Chip Roy, I don't like the deal. The people who call themselves part of that so-called Freedom Caucus. Does Kevin McCarthy have the ability to kind of whip those votes, or is that TBD?
We'll leave it to the speaker to win support from Republicans in Congress. The president said earlier he didn't think the speaker would have put this proposal forward if he wasn't able to garner the votes. But ultimately, we'll be trying to win Democratic support as well. We think both parties should support this. We may not get every single vote, but we will certainly fight to get a majority of those votes and believe that this is an agreement that can pass both chambers. If it's something that President Biden and Speaker McCarthy can get to yes on, that members of Congress who have political and ideological differences should be able to get there as well.
And final words to all those watching out there, many who were nervous, who are still nervous. There is a lot of layers of complexity here. What would be your final message to them as they approach this next week following Memorial Day weekend?
I think the most important thing, look, there's always complexities involved in a budget. And it's rare that you get everything you want in a budget, especially when there's a divided Congress. But ultimately, the most important thing, there's a ticking clock. And if Congress does not vote to avert default by June 5th, when the government can't pay its bills anymore, Social Security checks could be delayed. Retirement accounts will be affected. Borrowers will see their costs go up. 8 million jobs are on the line, and the economy could tip into a recession, both domestically and globally. And so Congress has to act. This is not a deal that if the president and Democrats were in charge of Congress, every word of this would be written the exact same way that it is. But we think it's a reasonable bipartisan agreement. And most importantly, it's going to ensure that we protect the economic gains, the 12.7 million jobs that have been created under this administration, the 800,000 manufacturing jobs, the investments in the clean energy economy, all of those things the president fought to protect and are protected in this agreement.
Ben LaBolt, White House Communications Director, thanks for joining us on the Midas Touch Network, and hope you'll join us again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Thank you. And this has been Ben Meiselas from the Midas Touch Network. Hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time on the Midas Touch Network.
Hey, Midas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.